Hey friends, in this tutorial I am taking you through my entire process for this watercolor fall scene. This is a full and beginner-friendly step-by-step lesson where I am taking you first through my sketching process and explaining important things having to do with creating a solid preliminary pencil sketch that you can then move on to painting. And then I'm sharing all of my favorite watercolor techniques and how I layer my watercolor to arrive at believable depth and luminous, vibrant results. This will be a great opportunity for beginners to continue developing foundational watercolor skills as well as color mixing. If you'd like to skip over the freehand sketching process and simply transfer my outline drawing onto your watercolor sheet, I'll be making that available for free in an open to the public post on my Patreon, which you're going to find a link to down below in the description box. All right, with all that said, let's jump in. All right, let's start with our preliminary pencil sketch, and I'm gonna try to keep this simple, but there are some perspective rules or principles that we have to make sure to pay attention to if we're going for believable results. I'm using an HB pencil and I'm trying to keep my pencil sketch light so that I don't see my pencil work at the end, and also so that I can easily erase mistakes as I go. I'm gonna start by adding in my horizon line, and the horizon line is that line that separates the ground from the sky, or the sea from the sky in seascapes. And because this is a nature scene, I'm gonna add some irregularity into it. It doesn't have to be a perfect straight horizontal line. And then from there, I'm gonna start by adding in my tree line in the distance, and I want to keep this light because I'm going to be erasing some sections of this in a bit when I start adding in my elements in the middle ground and foreground. So here these shapes are very loose. They're not specifically planned out, allowing these trees to take shape as I go. These are trees that are going to be farther away, so we don't want to make them super tall. Okay, so from here, I'm gonna start adding in a little path, a little dirt road, and it's gonna start somewhere around here. And as I said, perspective is important when you're drawing paths, streets, rivers. It is important that you visualize a vanishing point in the distance and make sure that this shape that you're creating is getting larger and larger as it's getting closer to us as the viewer of the scene. All right, so from here, I'm gonna add in a little tree. This tree is in the middle ground, so I want to make it smaller than the larger tree that's going to be over here on the left side. I do have a couple of videos on sketching different kinds of trees. I'll make sure to link to it down below in the recommended resources. I like starting by visualizing the tree trunk and making sure that the tree trunk and the branches are asymmetrical and irregular so that the tree can look natural. And of course, the leaves in and of themselves also look best if they are irregularly shaped. And oftentimes, if I don't push myself and remember to create an asymmetrical organic shape for the leaf portion, I end up with lollipop trees where it's just a circle or it's very, very symmetrical, and it ends up not looking very natural. So I need to remember that both as I am creating my preliminary sketch and also as I am moving on to painting this. When we're painting, we're not really filling in these shapes that we're drawing right now super carefully. We are loosely using the shapes that we have drawn in pencil to visualize the leaf portion, the tree trunk, etc., but we're not painting it in as if it were a coloring book page or something like that. I'm sure that my shapes will change as I'm painting this. A lot of the smaller branches up here are going to be added in after I have painted in the leaf portion and see what the values and the hues look like. Also, as we move along painting the leaves, we're gonna end up with little kind of empty sections where we can see through the leaves, but that happens organically as we're painting. Many times when I'm drawing trees, I just like to sketch in a little grass shape right here under the tree. Make sure that the bottom edge of all of your plant shapes or even tree shapes are not perfectly smooth, because this is all irregular grass, rocks and stuff in this natural scene on the ground, so you never want to create a perfectly smooth edge at the bottom of any of these elements. All right, and then we're gonna have a larger tree over here. So I start with the tree trunk, and the base of the tree trunk is going to be a little bit wider. I'm just sketching in some branches. And then again, I need a very irregular leaf shape. Draw lightly so that you can erase and refine and change your shapes as needed. I want to bring some sections in, then go back out. And maybe coming in from the top. Bring it up a little bit. All right, so once I like my tree shape, I'm going to add in another little grass section here beneath it. Keep the bottom edge regular and loose. This is going to be grass. Maybe I pull this shape all the way toward the left edge of my piece here. And I do want to add an extra small dry tree over here. Just like with this tree over here, I'm gonna end up with little windows, little gaps within the leaf portion of the tree. And I will be adding extra smaller branches within the leaf portion as well as I go. Erase this. You can erase the horizon line and any shapes that actually wouldn't be visible because there's something in front of that. You can go ahead and erase those pencil lines so that they don't confuse you as you are painting. Make sure that you understand your shapes. You want to know what are background trees in the distance and what are closer trees. And whenever the fence is following or is going alongside the edge of the road or path or whatever it is, you want to make sure that you also visualize the same vanishing point when you're drawing that fence. So this way, your fence is going to become taller and taller or larger and larger as it makes its way closer to you. So this is the top horizontal for that fence. And this right here is the bottom horizontal for this fence. Notice how these two lines are getting closer and closer as they're receding away and toward the vanishing point, right? This is the top. This is the bottom. It's alongside this edge of the path. And then once I have my horizontals, then all I need are my verticals, the little posts, right? Which I can just add in as shapes. And I don't want these shapes to be perfect because I want them to look like more rustic and perfect little wood posts. As these posts recede away and toward the vanishing point, I am making them closer and closer together and also less tall. As they're moving away and into the distance, I can just add in single lines as opposed to shapes like they are over here, because they also become less wide and less visible as it's making its way away from us. Under the fence, I can also add in little grasses, and wherever you want to add in extra shapes or lines to remind you of grasses or little plant sections that you want to make sure to add in, you can go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and start with the painting process. Let's take this section by section and practice some foundational, essential techniques for landscapes as we go. First, we're going to be painting the sky and the tree line in the farther away distance. I am going to be using ultramarine blue for the sky, and I will be adding a tiny bit of burnt umber into the ultramarine blue to mute it a little bit. So that is ultramarine blue. This right here is burnt umber, and I just need a bit to mute the ultramarine, make it look a little bit grayer. We do want to make sure that that the sky doesn't look too dark. A little bit of burnt umber or burnt sienna goes a long way for a slightly more muted blue. And I do want to prepare a puddle of new gamboge as well on my palette. I'm going to be painting in a tiny bit of new gamboge in the sky just a bit of that in the sky. And I do want to remind you, when you paint in your yellow onto the wet blue, avoid over blending at all costs, because you're gonna start creating a greenish color in your sky if you start over blending, and you can start flattening everything out. You can just use blue in your sky and that'll be fine as well. I'm gonna bring in a little bit of my Pyrrole Scarlet into the side of my palette as well, because I want to create a kind of an orange color, and I'm gonna create an orange color by adding in some new gamboge into this Pyrrole Scarlet. I want this to be more of a middle of the range orange as opposed to a red orange. So I'm gonna add more new gamboge into that. And then finally, I also want to prepare a bit of green, and this is Undersea Green from Daniel Smith. It's quite dark. It's a warm green, very rich green. I'm just gonna have some right here in this corner of my palette. And that is it in terms of the colors that we need for this first layer. And we're gonna be repeating these colors quite a bit, or use them in different ways throughout the piece. I'm gonna go ahead and change my water because we're gonna be doing some pre-wetting and we wanna use clean water for that. And these are the 3 brushes that I'm going to be using right now. This is a larger size 6 mop brush, which is great for pre-wetting large areas because mop brushes are very absorbent. And then these 2 are the brushes that I'm actually going to be using to paint my color in with. This is a size 14 round, and this is a size 6 round. I'm gonna be using my size 14 to paint in my color in the sky, and then I'm gonna be switching to this size 6 round brush to paint in the farther away trees. So here we go. We're gonna do pre-wetting. And why pre-wetting? Because pre-wetting is going to expand our working time before our paper starts to dry. When we work on dry paper, that paint starts drying immediately. And that is an issue, especially when painting large areas, because usually you want to avoid distracting texture and splotchiness. And the second thing that the pre-wetting does for us is, because watercolor always expands and diffuses when it is placed on wet paper, that water that we prepare our paper with is gonna do half of the work for us. It's gonna help us easily create those soft wet on wet effects that we want in the sky and in beginning layers in general. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to switch to my mop brush, size 6, and I'm going to take a little bit of water at a time from my container, and I'm going to pre-wet everything all the way down to the horizon line. And yes, I am pre-wetting over these trees in the middle ground and foreground. I'm pre-wetting everything. I will make sure not to directly place paint in this tree or this tree as I am painting in the layers in the background. But if a little bit of color gets into those trees, it's perfectly fine as long as the color is light and pale. And I do want a little bit of that sky and background elements to show through the little windows or gaps in the leaves of these trees. So it's a good thing if at least a little bit of that color goes into those leaf portions. Once I see that nice even sheen all throughout this area, I switch to my size 14 round brush and I'm going to start painting in my blue. I take a good amount of this slightly muted ultramarine blue and I start at the top. Tiny bit of blue in the tree, especially in the leaf portion. Going to quickly intensify the blue in the upper part of the sky just a little bit. Create more of my muted color mixture. And drop in a little bit of blue to intensify. And up here as well. Remove that blue from my paintbrush bristles, remove the excess water by dabbing the tip of my brush on my absorbent towel. And if you need to do any lifting, you can go ahead and do that. Use the clean and only slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge to remove any excess color that might have gotten into the trees. With a clean brush, I take a little bit of my yellow and I just pop it in here and there. making sure that I'm not over blending anything. And using my size 6 round brush, I'm going to start painting in the trees in the faraway tree line. Because I took my time with the pre-wetting process, everything is still wet and workable down here. I'm going to start with the lightest color that I'm going to be using for my trees, which is the yellow. And I'm going to start painting in this yellow in an irregular way throughout the tree line. And I'm just, again, avoiding placing paint directly into the trunks. So here's the orange that I created by mixing together New Gamboge and Pyrrole Scarlet. And I'm just going to be adding that in. Trying to understand where that tree line comes up to. Okay, you can see how I left many empty gaps with no yellow or orange. And I'm going to start painting in a little bit of my green. I remove that yellow and orange from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm now going in with my green. The color mixtures that I've been using so far are all kind of a coffee consistency. So they have a good amount of water in them, but also a good amount of color in them too. And this is important because we're painting on paper that is wet. And so if you go in with paint that is too watery and you paint that on wet paper, the water that is on your paper is going to get added to the water in your mixtures, and your color is going to appear even lighter. All right, so my paper is still quite wet, not super wet, but still wet to the point that my paint is moving around quite a bit when I drop it in there. So I'm going to just allow the paint and the water to sit on my paper just a tiny bit more, because I want to be able to place my paint and still see at least a blurry edge to this tree line. Right now, my paper is so wet that all of the color that I'm placing is still moving around a lot, and I can end up with green in my sky. So I'm just gonna allow this to sit for maybe 30-40 seconds or so and really try to notice the level of wetness that my paper has, because there are many degrees of wetness or dampness that we can work with when we're painting with this medium, and it all depends on the effect that you want. Of course, you never want to continue painting once your paper has already started to dry, because that's only going to lead to backruns and splotchiness and undesired textures. But within that wetness to dampness, there are many degrees that we can still work within. Going to do a little experiment here to see how wet the paper is. Still quite wet. Intensifying the orange. This is too red. I need more of my New Gamboge. I want to repeat the orange in the piece a lot, and the yellow and the green, but I don't want to bring in too much red. All right, I'm going to place a little bit more of my undersea green and see how that goes. I also want to be careful because I don't want this tree line in the faraway distance to compete too much visually with these trees in the middle ground and the foreground. If we make those trees in the distance too dark, we can just make them compete too much visually with these closer trees. And watercolor does dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So I allowed myself to push the undersea green, which is the darkest color, a little bit more, but hopefully at the end, especially because these trees we are going to be painting in 2 layers, my aim is for these trees to have a greater tonal variety and more depth and more detail in them, versus these trees farther back I want to keep blurred and with less detail and maybe less of a tonal contrast. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a tiny bit of lifting here in the tree trunks before my paint completely dries. I don't want to see a line going across those tree trunks. So we're all done with that first layer. Let's allow that to dry, and then we're gonna move on to paint this large area in the ground. All right, so everything over here is pretty much dry, so I can go ahead and paint in that initial wash in the ground area. We're going to be using the same pre-wetting process that we used for the upper half, and we want to make sure that we have our color mixtures, at least to start with, on our palette, and then we can make more as we go as needed. So for this bottom portion, we need the colors that we're going to be using in the path. These are going to be browns, and then we need the colors that we're going to be using for the grassy portions. Both areas need a range of values developed in them if we want realistic results. And it's very helpful to prepare color mixtures on our palettes that are going to allow us to develop that range of values. My main color in the path that I'm going to be using is burnt umber, which is this kind of chocolatey brown. And so I'm going to prepare a puddle of this brown right here. This is plain burnt umber. And then I'm going to prepare a second version of the same color, but it's going to be lighter. So I'm going to be adding in a color to lighten this brown for lighter value areas. And a nice color that I can do that with is my new gamboge. It's a color I'm already using, and I already talked about how good it is to repeat colors if you can, if it makes sense, because it'll create more harmonious and well integrated final results. And the yellow is a great option to lighten your browns with for something like this. All right, so I have my lighter brown and I have my darker brown for the path. And then for the grass areas, I'm going to be repeating the undersea green, which I was already using in the farther away tree line. And I'm going to create two puddles of undersea green. One is plain undersea green, which is already pretty dark and deep. And then the other puddle is going to be a lighter version of this. And I can also add in a little bit of new gamboge to create a lighter version of my green. Because the new gamboge is a warm yellow, you're going to end up with a more muted kind of olivey green color. If you add in a cool yellow, such as a lemon yellow, into your base green to create your lighter version of your green, you're going to end up with a brighter green, which can work beautifully for spring or summer landscapes. But right now, because this is a fall scene, I'm going for a more muted result. So I kept repeating my new gamboge for this. And finally, because I want to create the illusion of leaves that have fallen on the ground, I need to think of the colors that I'm going to be using to paint the leaves in both of these trees. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using the exact same colors that I use for these back trees in these trees in the middle ground and foreground. And so what does that mean? I need to prepare plain new gamboge. I need to prepare an orange, which is new gamboge plus a little bit of pyrrole scarlet. And I also need plain undersea green, which I already have over here. So preparing a little bit of my orange, more middle of the range orange. So I add in more new gamboge. Then I also need some plain new gamboge right here. And that's about it. So now I'm gonna go ahead and change my water again so that I can have clean water in my container as I'm doing my pre-wetting. Okay, so I'm gonna do the same thing where I start with my larger mop brush to do my pre-wetting effectively, and then I'm going to switch to my size 14 round and maybe even later to my size 6 if I find it's helpful for smaller areas that I'm looking to darken or things like that. So I'm taking a little water at a time from my container, and I'm starting with the pre-wetting process down here, and I'm pre-wetting everything. I'm gonna avoid, once again, painting in color directly into the tree trunks. Once I see that nice even sheen, I can switch on over to my size 14 round brush, and I'm gonna start with my lighter green, which has the new gamboge in it. Allow those colors to blend and bleed into each other. Allow some of that green to get into the path. This is not a coloring book page. We don't want to overly control. Doing a little bit of lifting here to reveal some of that paper under that paint. I'm going to start painting in the path. So I remove that green from my paintbrush bristles, and I'm going in with the lighter color first. that I have prepared for the path. And now I'm going in with my burnt umber, trying to develop a nice range of brown values while keeping some sections free of paint. It's always important to incorporate the bright paper as part of the piece for that beautiful watercolor glow. Gonna drop in a little bit of burnt umber in the grass. Tiny bit more darker green here in the little grassy plants under the tree, and also in this tree closer to us. I want to paint that in with a darker color so that we can actually see that as plants. And everything is still wet and workable, so I have a chance to continue developing my range of values and hues. Aerial or atmospheric perspective tells us that things that are closer to us are darker and more detailed. So I can pull from these principles and darken areas and create a wider range of values in these spaces closer to us. I'm going to switch to my size 6 round brush, and I'm going to start dropping in a little bit of yellow and orange into the ground below these trees. Orange, little blooms by touching the tip of my brush onto my wet paper. All right, that is enough. Going to develop some even darker browns in the path by thickening up my brown. This is burnt umber. And I'm just going to add thicker burnt umber in these closer sections of the path. Some shadow areas alongside these little plants for some texture. And the brown is going to become lighter and lighter as it moves away from us. Going in with a clean and slightly damp brush, just very gently pushing and pulling my color, or even lifting if things got a little bit too dark. All right, so now we can go ahead and start with these closer trees, and we're going to start by painting in the leaves. So as I said, for these leaves, we're going to be using the same colors that we use for the trees in the faraway distance, which is plain New Gamboge, or whatever warm yellow it is that you're using. And then we have our orange color mixture, which I created by mixing together the New Gamboge and the Pyrrole Scarlet. And then we also need the undersea green. I'm just going to add in a little bit more of this into this section of my palette. And now I'm going to be doing a little bit of pre-wetting with water using my size 14 round brush. I am going in and using circular motions. I'm not trying to evenly wet the entire shape that I have created for the leaves of this tree. I'm just trying to pre-wet some sections with a scribbling or kind of a circling motion so that I can get some soft effects in this first layer. You can see how I've left some little gaps so that my color doesn't go into those gaps and I can still see the background in those areas. I'm gonna start painting in my color with my size 14, but I'm gonna switch to my size 6 in just a bit. Starting with the lightest color, which is the plain New Gamboge. And I'm gonna use just the tip of my brush and continue using little circular motions to paint in some of this first color. Then I'm going to go right into the orange, paint in some of this color as well, touching just the tip of my brush to my paper. I'm going to remove the yellow and the orange from my paintbrush bristles, remove that excess water, and I'm going right in with the undersea green. Some sections of my paper are drying, others are dry, and others are wet. And this is going to create a nice variety of effects in my tree. I want these colors to blend together on their own. I'm not doing any manual blending myself. I'm gonna switch to my size 6 round brush and continue using the same motion with this brush. Back to my orange. As you can see, I'm not blending myself. If I start going like this, I can start creating mud. I want to avoid that. I'm just dropping in my color and allowing the blending to happen on its own. Back to my undersea green. I'm gonna create some darker areas. And with your smaller brush, you can also create teeny tiny shapes coming out of the leaf portion of the tree. Little irregular, teeny tiny shapes with just the tip of your brush, which can help convey leaves. All right, that's it. That's all I'm gonna do for this first layer. If I continue adding more and more color, I can overly darken things too much or even start creating a muddy mess. So I'm gonna leave that alone, and I'm gonna do the same thing for this tree in the middle ground. Because this is a smaller tree, I'm gonna go right in with my size 6 round brush, but I'm gonna use the same technique where I first do a little bit of pre-wetting with water. Visualize that irregular, asymmetrical leaf portion of the tree. And once you have created that very irregular, imperfect, wet shape, start with your lighter color. Paint that in an irregular, loose way. Once you have some of that color painted in, move on to your second color, which is the orange. That's a little bit too much. I'm gonna absorb some of that. Remove the yellow and the orange from my paintbrush bristles and start going in with the undersea green, which will help add a little bit more structure to the tree because right now it's all just lighter valleys with the yellow and the orange. Going back to the orange, adding in teeny tiny leaf shapes around those edges. Also want some leaf shapes with the green. I'm gonna add in more leaf shapes later when I add more detail into the trees. For the tree trunks, I'm using my size 3 round brush, and I'm just painting those on dry paper. I am going to be using the same 2 colors that I was using in the path. So remember how we lightened the brown by adding in the warm yellow into it? I'm creating more of those same 2 color mixtures, adding some new gamboge into the burnt umber for a lighter brown. And I always start with the lighter color. So I'm starting with the light brown, kind of a coffee consistency. And I'm gonna make sure to leave plenty of irregularity down here along the bottom edge of the tree because again, that's grass. And if I just paint in a smooth edge, that's gonna look a little bit unnatural. You can leave little teeny tiny sections of paper unpainted. That will help you create the illusion of wood texture. Dropping in a bit of a darker brown down here where the grass is creating a shadow on that tree trunk and a little bit along the trunk itself. Dropping in some darker brown right under the leaves. And I just paint the tree trunk up into the leaf portion. I'm going to wait for the leaves to dry before painting in the small branches in this area because I want those to be sharp and defined. I'm gonna paint in this tree trunk as well. Irregularity along the bottom edge. Making my way up with short tapered strokes. And then I use some darker brown in shadow areas and to convey a little bit of texture in the trunk. And I'm also going to paint in the dry tree over here. Going in with a lighter brown first. And then just darkening some little sections with the plain burnt umber. I'm going to use these same two colors to paint in the fence. Starting with the lighter brown. This is still my size 3 round brush. Maybe I paint 2 at a time. First lighter brown, then drop in a little bit of the darker brown here and there. And I do want these closer posts to appear thicker and darker. So as I make my way toward the back posts or the farther away posts, I make sure that I am going in with lighter paint. Maybe it's more watered down, but also that I'm going in with just the tip of my brush so that they can look thinner and thinner. And now for the horizontal line, starting with the lighter brown again. I'm going to break some of these lines. Thicken up the brown by adding in more of my burnt umber and painting in some small darker brown shapes in these sections nearest us. All right, so getting started with the last little stretch in our painting process, we have a few more things we have to do. Let's start by adding in some shadow shapes in the leaf portion of our trees. And because these are shadow shapes, I am just preparing the 2 darker color mixtures that I was using to paint the leaves of these trees, which were my orange that I created by mixing together my yellow and my red. And I also made sure to have a little puddle of my undersea green as well. So this time I am going in on dry paper and I'm using my size 6 round brush to paint in irregular abstract shadow shapes as I visualize clusters of leaves that are coming forward and are creating shadows on clusters of leaves underneath. And I'm mostly going in with my orange first, and then I'm dropping in some of my green in those orange areas while that orange is still wet. Unless I want to create a darker shadow shape in an area that already has plenty of that undersea green in it, so it's pretty dark. In those cases, I do go in with my plain undersea green right away. Because we are painting on dry paper, you're going to be left with these sharp defined edges around these shapes that you are painting in. If at any point you want to go in and soften some edges, simply rinse out your brush and go in to run those bristles over the edge that you're looking to soften. But I do want to encourage you not to spend too much time softening and leave some edges sharp so that you can have that balance between soft, diffused effects and sharper edges. Also, because we're already using colors that can very easily become muddy, you want to be careful with your layering, with your scrubbing, with your blending, and also the softening that you do. I also want you to notice how I am leaving plenty of that underneath first layer that I painted in this leaf portion of the tree visible and uncovered by this new layer that I am painting in. It is important to leave a lot of that first layer shining through unpainted because those are the lighter values, and if we go in and cover all of the lighter values up, we can very easily arrive at flat, heavy looking results that are way too dark. Your trees will end up lacking that sense of dimension and glow that we're trying to create. Because of our color combo that we're using for these fall trees, it is normal for us to end up with colors that look a little bit more desaturated. That is the point, because we want these leaves to look dry and muted. but we're still looking to develop that watercolor glow and a nice vibrancy in our colors. It definitely helps to keep order in your mixing areas as well, because if your browns start mixing into your yellows and your oranges, you're going to end up with more muted yellows and oranges. So pay attention to that as well as you're moving forward. Try to keep things organized. All right, so I finished painting those larger shadow shapes. I switched on over to the smallest brush that I am using for this painting process, which is my size 3. And I'm using the bouncing technique to add in more detail in the form of teeny tiny leaves. I am using my orange and my green and simply touching the tip of my brush to stamp on little teeny tiny leaf shapes, both inside of the tree and outside of the tree. This is a good opportunity to add in not only more detail, but also more of a sense of irregularity along those edges. All right, so here I'm moving on to doing the exact same thing with the tree in the middle ground. Because this is a smaller tree, I do go in with my size 3 brush to paint in those shadow shapes. And I continue using this brush for the teeny tiny leaf shapes. You might want to consider developing less detail, less of a tonal contrast in this tree in the middle ground than what you did in the tree that is closer to us, because this will help you develop that sense of distance, what is closer and what is farther back. And then it was time to finally paint in those smaller branches. If you don't have much experience painting branches, I would recommend sketching in those lines in pencil first. Just make sure that everything is completely dry, and this way you're going to have something to trace over. Otherwise, you're going to have to visualize these as you go. I'm going right in with my burnt umber and just the tip of my size 3 round brush, visualizing these branches coming out from the main tree trunk, out and away, making sure that as I am moving away from the central tree trunk, that my little branches become finer and more tapered. And I do this by making sure that I'm just using the very tip of my brush, and I am using more of a flicking motion in that last section that is farthest away from the tree trunk. It is important as you are painting in these branches to skip over certain sections of those leaves so that you can create the illusion of leaves overlapping over sections of branches. If you paint these branches just completely visible from start to end, it's not going to end up looking very natural. Consider overlapping of leaves. If you want to go in to darken certain sections of these branches, simply do a little bit more layering with your burnt umber. Consider thickening up the burnt umber by adding in more paint into your mixture and using it in that way. But I'm trying to develop at least a couple of brown values even in these branches, some lighter sections and some darker sections. Once I was finished with the branches in this closer tree, I did the same thing with the tree farther back, maybe adding fewer branches and making sure that I'm just going in on to painting in some darker shadow shapes in the tree trunks. Now that that first layer has completely dried and those browns look lighter, I do want to go in to develop darker shadow shapes, especially under the leaves and maybe behind the grasses that are right at the base of those trees. Here I'm adding a little bit more detail in the trees, and I'm also going to be adding very, very thin and light brown tree trunks and branches in the tree line in the back using the very tip of my brush and a watered down burnt umber mixture. I want to make those very, very subtle. Again, the farther back, the lighter and the thinner and the less detail, right? So make sure that any tree trunks and branches you add to the tree line at the back are very, very subtle. Just adding in a few details in the piece before moving on to developing the darker values and textures in the grasses. I decide to add one smaller dry tree in the middle ground area. I do the same thing that I did to paint the dry tree in the foreground. And finally, I finish this one up by adding some darker shadow shapes in the grasses and ground area. For this, I switch on back to my size 6 round brush, and I'm mainly using my undersea green in more of a milk consistency at this point. All I want to do here is develop some darker, irregular, organic shadow shapes here and there in the grasses, just to add a little bit more tonal contrast and detail to these areas, especially to the areas nearest us. And I can leave the areas of grass in the middle ground as they are. You can see how as I am painting in these abstract shadow shapes, I am leaving plenty of that underneath layer shining through to help me create the illusion of lighter values. And I also switch between more of a bouncing or almost a scribbling motion to an upward flicking motion to create the illusion of grasses. Less is more, so I'm trying not to go overboard. All right, and with that, we're all done with this fall watercolor landscape. I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope that you were able to practice some essential techniques that you can take with you to future watercolor paintings. And if you have any comments or questions, I always love hearing from you. Go ahead and leave them in the comments below. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.